Yeah, hello. Welcome to another paper discussion on narrative visualization. That's the third small video presentation. Not too long, but about an interesting topic, communicating data to an audience. It is based on a book chapter where Stephen Drucker from Microsoft Research is the first author. And yeah, you see the full author list with some familiar names like Robert Kusara, who published about storytelling also at other places. This book chapter, if I see this correctly, is the result of a Dachstuhl discussion, a Dachstuhl workshop. So also in the next video, I will present another chapter from the same book resulting from such a discussion at Dachstuhl Castle, communicating data to an audience. So my outline is not too long, yeah. So they thought about what does the audience really know, in which aspects you must try to understand your target audience with respect to their prerequisites, to avoid that either your visualization techniques or interaction techniques or also the textual components of a narrative visualization like labels and captions and so on are too difficult and cannot be really understood very well. So ideally, of course, our target audience would be quite smart in understanding the data and understanding visualization techniques. So on the one hand, of course, we have to adapt to the actual prerequisites and knowledge of the target audience. But of course, they also thought a little bit about how to increase this. Yeah, what can be improved with respect to gaps and deficits in data and visualization literacy. And then there was also a discussion that I found quite valuable, namely about frequent user needs, or one could also say about motivations that users may have. Yeah, why do they look in your online story or whatever kind of narrative visualization you provide to them? Because if you have a basic understanding of what are typical user needs, you can deliberately design the story in such a way that you fulfill these needs. That you fulfill a need where you don't have an idea that it really exists, that would be really a surprise. Yeah, what does the audience know? Which kind of knowledge you may expect and which expectations the audience may have. Yeah, so that involves different aspects. One of them is data literacy. Yeah, for example, people that read many data stories or even have professional tasks that involve data analysis have a strong awareness for the limited accuracy of data. They know that data is often incomplete, not completely reliable, that some data is subject to measurement noise, for example. Yeah, you know, I always think about medical examples. If you are a bit familiar with medical data, like data related to the corona incidents, then you know there is a difference, and that may be a strong difference between the actual cases and the reported cases. Yeah, the same is true for crime statistics, for example. It could be that it appears that a certain crime occurs more and more often, but perhaps only the number of reported cases increased, whereas the actual number of cases is stable. Yeah, so to have this in mind would mean data literacy. Then there is background knowledge about the domain. Yeah, how familiar you are with the domain in which data are presented. So crime statistics, for example, are you familiar with the types of crimes, for example, and also in regional differences? Have you also already some hypothesis in mind where a certain crime could occur more often or not? That also affects, of course, how interesting a story could be for you. Then there is visualization literacy. That means the familiarity with, for example, chart types and related interactions. Cognitive abilities, yeah, so how good are users in problem solving, decision making, strategic planning, and other cognitive abilities. A little bit related are attention spans. Yeah, a typical news reader wants to read an article that takes 5 minutes or so. Yeah, maybe 8 minutes, but not much longer. A decision maker, on the other hand, knows if he looks into data and a related story, probably to make a good and informed decision, and not to jump too fast to conclusions requires more time, maybe 20 minutes or so. Yeah. So what is your target audience supposed to be with respect to their attention span? Stephen Drucker and colleagues also discussed a term that I read very rarely. I'm not sure if I have read it at all before, namely interaction literacy. I often read about visualization literacy, but not so much about interaction literacy. Probably most authors in visualization would say, well, I consider a chart type, for example, and the interactions that are possible with this chart type still as part of visualization literacy. But I think there is also a good reason to separate this and also think about interaction literacy. In the chapter, they report that New York Times had experiences with their comprehensive online journal that only 10 to 15% of the people interact with the stories. The only thing that they have to do is to scroll. Yeah, you may know the term scrollytelling. For stories in online journals where you basically vertically scroll. So that's familiar to all users, but everything else, you cannot rely on the fact that users are familiar with this, and even if they would be familiar with this, whether they actually make use of it. They made the following expression: to make the user do anything else than scrolling, that only works if the users expect a spectacular result. Yeah, something that's really worthwhile to find, to read, and to reason about. That includes also tooltips. Yeah, we as visualization designers may assume that information that we provide as tooltips is read by our users. Yeah, at least if this is something they could be interested in. But actually, tooltips are rarely used, so even if they could provide potentially very interesting information for the actual viewer, they may not be aware of it and just don't use it. So the recommendation that the authors here derived is: don't hide essential information in a tooltip. Better make it permanently available as part of a scatterplot, for example. Yeah, of course, to make too much information permanently available, then you risk to create something that's called visual clutter. There is just too much information. Yeah, like many design decisions, that's a trade-off. But I found it interesting that tooltips are potentially not so useful as one may think. How to increase data and visualization literacy? Of course, you can try to educate your audience. Yeah, here's a course, a video, or whatever that explains to you some chart types and how it is frequently read, and which misperceptions may exist. Yeah, that certain values are systematically over or underestimated with certain chart types. You could try to educate people in this direction. To have such courses is definitely a good idea, but on the other hand, to assume that the large majority of your readers will actually deal with this is probably risky. What works better is that you integrate information directly in your narrative visualizations, namely in the so-called annotation layer. Yeah? And annotation comprises to a large extent textual information, but could also be graphical annotations, like arrows, for example, really point to something that is important for some reason. Yeah. So the question is actually how you make use of captions and labels, and to some extent you should do this, of course, tooltips or descriptions that apply for selected objects in a visualization or selected regions. So here is an example that I found quite interesting. It is more than 150 years old, actually 170 years old, from the New York Tribune. Weekly death by cholera and total weekly death are shown here over time in New York. And at that time, even such a line chart was not familiar to users. Yeah, to convey data with visualizations, that was very unknown. So what types of annotations do we see here? We see a kind of headline. We see the specific numbers are shown, some grid lines, as I would call them. We see that the two different curves are labeled directly beneath the curves. So that's something you rarely see today. So typically there are two different colors, and then there's a legend that says this color represents this and this color represents something else. One may argue that's not too bad, even if the layout is difficult to compute, probably, to have it directly here, so that, yeah, it is a little bit more direct how the label can be interpreted. The message, I think, is quite clear. Not only that the weekly death by cholera increased, but almost in the same way, the total weekly death increase. For a person with high data literacy, that means the increase in cholera cases is not just an artifact of the statistics, but instead the overall number of deaths is increased approximately in the same manner, which increases the likelihood very strongly that these cases are indeed cholera cases. Yeah. If, for example, we would just test more for cholera and then more people that are dying are considered as cholera victims, but the overall number of them just has not changed, that would not increase at the same time the total weekly death. Yeah. So, and many aspects of how this data can be interpreted are described here in this very long caption. Yeah. Many different details, what happened at July 7, for example, that's this part here of the diagram, that is really commented here. What happened in the week from August 4 to August 11, that's this week. Yeah, that's all written here. That's a bit cumbersome to read. For you in the moment, it's not even possible to read it. For the journal reader, it was, but it makes sure that the data is interpreted from the visualization in a reasonable way. We say on the one hand that a picture says more than 1,000 words, but on the other hand, we cannot rely so much which are the more than 1,000 words that a picture tells you. And here they take, to a strong extent, control over the message conveyed by the image. So I thought a little bit about, can we create a computer program that makes such visualizations? And of course, that's not completely impossible, but I would say it's difficult. Here's a more recent example from the Los Angeles Times in 2013, a scatter plot-based visualization, or what can even say a bubble plot. With this, I refer to the different sizes of these circles. A scatter plot with 4 quadrants, that's quite frequent. Yeah, you have decreases and increases in 2 different directions. Yeah, so here I would say the layout would be easier to compute. Yeah, so it shows the increases in property crime, but violent crime decreases. Violent crime rate and property crime rate in different parts of the US. It's indicated here that things get better if we have a decrease in both directions, and get worse if we have an increase in both directions. So it's immediately clear that we have a problem in San Francisco and Oxnard. We do not know about the absolute numbers of crimes in these different categories, but we see the development, the gradient. Yeah, more violent and property crime, and here it's even labeled San Francisco saw jumps in the rate of every crime category except murder between 2012 and 2013. Theft of personal property rose by 27% and rapes by 47%. So these specific numbers explain this overall situation here of San Francisco. Yeah, and here are some regions like Santa Clara and Santa Ana, also in California, where the numbers decreased. Interestingly, here is a city called Corona. Nice. Yeah. So if we want to automatically generate visualizations like this, we could think of a reusable component, a class in narrative visualization authoring system that allows to create such bubble plots with captions for every quadrant, with colors for every quadrant, with labels, with legends. Yeah, so that is what could be done in principle and would be quite useful, perhaps across a variety of applications. Yeah, what are primary motivations? That is what they discussed under the umbrella term user needs. A primary motivation for many users, that's why they have a look in newspapers or look at news on TV. They want to stay informed about the current situation. Yeah, that makes it possible for you to have a common ground with others to chat. Yeah, so that's a typical user need, and it of course also satisfies curiosity. Another primary motivation is gaining insight into oneself. So is there something where I am somehow involved and affected, or seeing models for others' behavior. Yeah, maybe I learned something, and at the end I can better understand my friends, family members, and so on. Other primary motivations would be to socially interact and connect with others. Yeah, so maybe with a comment function and others comment as well, and yeah, maybe something arises from this. And of course also relaxing entertainment or diversion. And if you think about narrative visualizations, I think it's immediately clear that they will not fulfill all these four basic motivations at the same time. Yeah, some topics are not very appropriate for entertainment and diversion. Others are very appropriate for this, but they are not so much informative. You know that I always think about generating medical stories, and there I would say the first two motivations are primarily important. Yeah, you want to stay informed about the current situation with respect to severe and frequent diseases, infectious diseases, or something else that has an acute component, and you may be interested in gaining insight into yourself, and understanding also maybe the health situation of others. Yeah, what could be done in order to fulfill this need of being informed? So one frequent technique is to ask the users to make a guess. Yeah, there's a rhetorical questions. Users should make a guess about it. They then see what other users guessed. They see what the truth is. So that gives you something to reason about. Another aspect is to gain insight into oneself. Yeah, what could be done for this? For this, it would be quite useful to enable something that's called self-identification. So for example, if I read or see visualizations related to disease statistics, health statistics, yeah, it would be good if I can select my city and my country and see about the situation there. Or that would apply to many other, not only medical applications, but also in medicine. In medicine, of course, the risk for many things depends on age and weight and whether you are male or female or blood pressure. So maybe you are enabled to specify these values, probably using your own values, but maybe also some values of others that you want to understand. And then you get an understanding of, for example, the risk that a person with these specifications would have for a disease, for a severe variant of the disease, for an early outbreak of the disease, or whatever. Yeah, so what are take-home messages and consequences here? Understanding of users' needs and prerequisites, that means what they know about with respect to data, the domain, visualization, interaction literacy. That's quite essential, so be careful with this. And when you make evaluations, ask users about all these aspects of expectations and previous knowledge and motivation. That enables to compare whether the expectations that you had when you started to design the system actually match the target user group. It could be a good idea to allow users to comment on the stories. That could be motivating. Yeah, that's also something I've somehow read from this paper. Yeah, here are the references, just these two. That is the paper that I've introduced, communicating data to an audience, a chapter in the book Data-Driven Storytelling. I guess that the whole book is quite interesting. Yeah, approximately 20 pages. And one essential reference that they used was from Thomas Ruggiero, Uses and Gratifications Theory in the 21st Century, in a journal entitled Mass Communication and Society. Yeah, with this I want to thank you for your attention.